August 1936. Harlem. A crooked cop walked into a grocery store and took $3,000 like it was his birthright. 48 hours later, he was gone, badge stripped, career buried, name erased from the precinct like he never existed. No gun, no blood, no trial, just Bumpy Johnson and a trap the cop never saw coming. To understand how. We go back to that first knock on the door. The summer of 1936 did not arrive gently in Harlem. It came with heat that pressed down on the pavement like a hand on a man's throat, slow, deliberate, without apology. By August, the air on 125th Street smelled like burnt rubber, cheap cologne, and something older. Something that had no name but every resident recognized. It was the smell of people who had learned, long ago, that survival required silence. Samuel Hargrove had operated his grocery store on the corner of Lenox Avenue for 11 years. He knew every crack in his floorboards. He knew which shelf leaned left after a hard rain. He knew his customers by their footsteps before they reached the door. Mrs. Patterson with her slow shuffle. The Wilson boys who always ran. Old Carter who dragged his left heel from a wound that never healed right. What Hargrove did not know, on the morning of August 14th, was that the day would end with his hands shaking and $3,000 gone from the lockbox beneath the counter. Officer Declan Pike arrived at 10:47 in the morning. He did not knock. Men like Pike did not knock. The bell above the door announced him before his shadow did, and Hargrove looked up from the crate of peaches he was sorting to find a blue uniform filling his doorway, like a wall that had grown legs. Pike was not a large man by any physical measure. He stood perhaps 5'10", with narrow shoulders and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from a piece of lumber and never sanded smooth. But size was never what made a man dangerous in Harlem. What made Pike dangerous was the way he moved, slow, unhurried, as though every room he entered already belonged to him. "Morning," Pike said. He did not wait for a response. He was already walking, his eyes sweeping the shelves with the casual precision of a man who had done this many times before. Hargrove set down a peach. "Can I help you, officer?" Pike picked up a can of tomatoes, turned it over in his hands, and set it back in the wrong place. "Health inspection," he said. "City's been cracking down. Lot of violations in the neighborhood lately." He paused at the meat counter, leaned forward, and inhaled slowly. "You been keeping your temperatures right?" "Everything's in order," Hargrove said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. Pike turned and looked at him for a long moment. The store was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigeration unit and the distant sound of a child crying somewhere on the street outside. Then Pike smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how the conversation would end. "See, that's the thing," Pike said. "The city doesn't always agree with what the owner thinks is in order. Takes time to process a violation. Store gets shut down while the paperwork clears. Could be weeks." He picked up another can, examined it, set it down. Weeks is a long time for a man to lose income. The meaning was as clear as broken glass on a clean floor. Hargrove had $3,000 in the lockbox. He had saved it across 14 months, every dollar wrung from early mornings and late nights, from cutting his own margins thin, from paying his 2 part-time employees in cash to avoid the overhead. It was not a fortune. In Harlem in 1936, it was a lifeline. He handed it over. Pike counted it at the counter without embarrassment. He folded the bills with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to receiving things that did not belong to him, slid them into the inside pocket of his jacket, and buttoned it closed with one hand. Investigators who later reviewed cases like this one noted that officers operating in black neighborhoods during this era rarely faced internal consequences. The paperwork simply disappeared. "Smart man," Pike said. "I'll make sure the inspection report reflects that everything was satisfactory." He left the way he came, without hurry, without acknowledgement, without looking back. Hargrove stood behind the counter for a long time after the bell above the door went silent. The refrigeration unit hummed. A fly landed on the edge of the peach crate and walked in a small, aimless circle. Outside, a car horn sounded twice and then stopped. He was still standing there when his first customer of the afternoon came in 40 minutes later and asked if he was feeling all right. He said yes, he was not all right. The old people in the neighborhood would say, for years afterward, that Pike never left a store without taking something. What they meant was not just the money. They meant the thing a man carries in his chest that keeps him standing upright, the quiet, dignified belief that his work belongs to him. Pike came back the next morning. This time, he wanted double. There is a particular kind of humiliation that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with shouting or broken glass or the dramatic collapse of something visible. It arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary night. When a man is lying on his back staring at the ceiling, and the full weight of what happened finally settles onto his chest like something permanent. Samuel Hargrove did not sleep on the night of August 14th. He lay in the back room behind his store. He had not made it home, had not been able to face the 4 blocks between the shop and his apartment, and he listened to Harlem breathe around him. The distant trumpet from the club 2 streets over, the slow creak of the building settling in the heat, the occasional voice rising and falling on the sidewalk outside. He thought about the precinct on 123rd Street. He thought about walking in, asking to speak to a sergeant, sitting down across a desk from another blue uniform and saying the words, "An officer came into my store and took my money." He thought about the face that sergeant would make. He had seen that face before, not on himself, but on others. It was the face of a door closing, not with anger, not even with contempt, just a door, swinging shut, as naturally as breathing. Reporting a cop to the cops in Harlem in 1936 was not bravery. It was arithmetic, and the numbers did not work. By morning, Hargrove had made a different decision. There was a bar on 131st Street called Delroy's, a narrow room with low ceilings, a jukebox that played 3 seconds late, and a bartender named Marcus who had the remarkable ability to hear everything and remember selectively. Delroy's was not the kind of place where business was conducted openly. It was the kind of place where a word passed quietly from one man to another across a sticky countertop could travel further by midnight than a telephone call could travel in a week. Hargrove arrived at Delroy's at 10:30 in the morning, before the lunch crowd, when the bar held only 2 old men playing cards at a corner table and Marcus wiping glasses that were already clean. He did not ask for Bumpy Johnson by name. In Harlem, you did not make that request out loud, in the open, in a room where the walls were thin and strangers were always possible. Instead, Hargrove ordered a coffee he did not drink, and when Marcus set it down in front of him, Hargrove said, very quietly, "A man came into my store, took what wasn't his. I'm not looking for moneybacks, I'm looking for it to stop." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to wiping the glass in his hand. That was all. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the message had moved, not through telephones or written notes, but through the invisible infrastructure that Harlem had built across decades of learning to communicate outside the systems that excluded it. A word to a numbers runner on 128th. A nod from the runner to a woman who managed 3 rooming houses and knew everyone's business as a professional necessity. From her, a quiet conversation in the back of a laundromat on 133rd, where a man in a good suit listened without expression and then left without finishing his coffee. Bumpy Johnson received the message that evening. He was seated in a booth at a restaurant on 7th Avenue that served the best roast chicken in northern Manhattan and kept a private room in the back for conversations that required privacy. He listened to the message without interruption, the kind of stillness that made the man delivering it feel uncomfortably, like every word was being weighed on a scale he could not see. When it was finished, Bumpy asked 2 questions. He asked the name of the officer, and he asked whether the store owner had gone to the precinct. The answer to the first question was Declan Pike. The answer to the second was no. Bumpy nodded slowly. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of chicken, and ate it. Those who knew him then would tell you later, and some of them did tell it. Carefully. In the years after that, Bumpy's silences were never empty. They were the sound of a decision being assembled, piece by piece, with the kind of care most men reserved for things they could not afford to get wrong. "Find out where else Pike has been collecting," he said. That was all. But the man sitting across from him understood that a short answer from Bumpy Johnson was never a small answer. It was the first move on a board that most people in the room could not yet see. What Bumpy did not know yet was that Pike had already heard the name. Someone had talked. The message that was supposed to travel invisibly had brushed against a loose thread, and Pike, who had survived 11 years of this work precisely because he was careful, had pulled it. By nightfall, Pike knew Bumpy Johnson had been asked for. The old men at Delroy's would say later that the moment Bumpy's name entered a room, something in the air shifted the way pressure drops before a storm. That strange stillness when every living thing goes quiet because something larger than all of them is on its way. They were not wrong. Bumpy Johnson did not make decisions the way other men made decisions. Other men in his position operated on instinct, sharpened by violence. They responded to threats the way a fist responds to an open palm, fast, direct, final. It was an effective strategy in certain situations. It was also a strategy that had put a significant number of those men in graves before they reached 40. Bumpy was 31 years old in the summer of 1936. He intended to be considerably older. What separated him was not courage. The streets of Harlem had no shortage of courage. Courage was cheap, and it got people killed every season. What separated Bumpy was patience, the willingness to sit with a problem, to turn it over in his hands the way a jeweler turns over a stone, examining every facet before deciding what it was worth and what it would cost to cut it right. The problem with Declan Pike was not that he was dangerous. The problem was what touching him would cost. Harlem in 1936 existed in a state of negotiated tension with the NYPD. It was not a peace. It was not even a truce. It was an arrangement fragile, constantly renegotiated, dependent on 1,000 small calculations made daily by men on both sides who understood that the alternative to arrangement was chaos. And chaos was expensive for everyone. If Bumpy moved against a uniformed officer directly, if Pike disappeared, or was found in an alley, or turned up in a condition that required explanation, the precinct's response would not be surgical. It would be a flood. Every numbers house, every bar, every backroom operation in a 12-block radius would be hit simultaneously. Dozens of men would be arrested. Dozens of families would lose income. The message would be clear and brutal: touch one of ours and we burn the neighborhood. Bumpy had seen it happen before. He had no intention of being the reason it happened again. So he did not move against Pike. Not yet. Not directly. Instead, on the morning of August 16th, he put 3 people to work. Their instructions were simple. Follow Pike. Not to threaten him. Not to approach him, simply to watch. To document every store he entered, every conversation he had on the street, every envelope that changed hands. To note the time, the location, the names of witnesses. To be invisible. To be patient. The 3 people Bumpy chose were not fighters. They were observers, men and women who had spent years learning how to exist in spaces without being noticed, which in Harlem was a skill as valuable as any other. One of them, a man named Thomas who sold newspapers from a cart on 125th. could stand on a corner for 6 hours without a single passerby registering his presence. Another, a woman named Grace, who Bumpy had known since childhood, ran a seamstress shop 2 blocks from Pike's usual patrol route and had the kind of face that people looked through without meaning to. They began their work on the morning of the 16th and delivered their first report by evening. Pike, it turned out, was not a lone operation. In the 48 hours that Bumpy's people watched him, Pike collected money from 7 different businesses along his patrol corridor. Not all of them paid willingly. 2 appeared to argue. Briefly, before the argument ended the way arguments with uniformed men always ended in that neighborhood. But what was more interesting than the collections themselves was the pattern beneath them. Pike was not choosing his targets randomly. He moved with too much precision, arriving at businesses that had just received large deliveries, or had recently hired new staff, or were operating in the narrow window between one city inspection and the next. He knew too much about the internal rhythms of each store to be operating purely on observation. Someone was feeding him information. Bumpy sat with this on the evening of August 17th, the way he sat with all difficult things quietly, in a room with no distractions, letting the implications arrange themselves in order of importance. Someone inside the network was selling access, selling names, schedules, financial details, turning Harlem's own commerce into a target list for a corrupt cop. It was, Bumpy understood, a worse problem than Pike himself. A corrupt cop could be exposed, transferred, neutralized through the right channels. There were ways, if you were careful and patient and willing to wait for the right moment. But an informant inside the network was something else entirely. An informant was a wound that kept bleeding from the inside, invisible until the damage was already done. What happened next was the kind of thing that only makes sense in retrospect, the moment when a story that looked like it was about one man's greed revealed itself to be about something much older and much larger. People who lived through that summer in Harlem would spend decades trying to explain it to those who hadn't, and they always arrived at the same conclusion. You had to have been there to understand how a neighborhood could hold that many secrets and still function as a neighborhood. He did not yet know who it was, but the name was already somewhere in the information his people had gathered. He simply had not found it yet. Bumpy Johnson remembered every alley in Harlem the way other men remembered unpaid debts, precisely, permanently, and with full intention of settling the account. The name was in there. He just needed to find it. The name came on a Wednesday. It came the way most dangerous things came in Harlem, not with fanfare, not with warning, but quietly. Tucked inside an ordinary sentence spoken by someone who did not fully understand what they were handing over. Grace, the seamstress, had been watching Pike's route for 3 days when she noticed something that did not fit. Pike never hesitated. He walked to each store with the confidence of a man reading from a prepared list, no scanning the block, no pausing to consider, no doubling back. He knew exactly which door to push open before he reached it. She reported this to Bumpy on the evening of August 18th. Bumpy listened without moving. He was seated at the same table in the same restaurant on 7th Avenue, and the roast chicken in front of him went untouched while Grace spoke. When she finished, he asked her one question. "Does he check anything before he goes in?" "A notebook, a piece of paper, anything written." Grace thought about it. Then she said, "His left breast pocket. He touches it, just once, before each door." Bumpy nodded. He picked up his fork. He set it back down. There was a man named Roy Sellers who operated out of a shoe repair shop on 129th Street. On the surface, Sellers was unremarkable, a thin man in his late 40s with ink-stained fingers and a habit of humming to himself while he worked. What most people did not know, and what a careful few did, was that Sellers had spent 15 years building one of the most complete informal directories of Harlem commerce in existence. He knew which stores were profitable, which were struggling, which had just signed new supplier contracts, which were behind on city fees. He had compiled this information the way some men collected stamps methodically, obsessively, without any clear original purpose. Bumpy had known about Sellers for years. He had even used him, occasionally, for legitimate purposes. Sellers was not a violent man. He was not a cruel man. He was something more dangerous than either. He was a man who had convinced himself that information was neutral, that selling knowledge was not the same as choosing sides. The debt connection surfaced on the same evening Grace delivered her report. Thomas had spent 2 days quietly asking questions along Pike's route, not about Pike, but about the stores themselves, about their histories, about who knew their business well enough to predict their slow weeks and their flush ones. By the time he reported back, he had 4 names. 3 were easily eliminated. The 4th was Roy Sellers. Hargrove's store was on Sellers' list because of a 2-year-old argument over a supplier introduction that Hargrove had never paid for. A small grievance that had calcified over time into something Sellers had decided, in his private accounting, justified what he was doing. It was the kind of reasoning that made sense only in the dark. When a man is alone with his resentments and there is no one to tell him how small the justification actually is, Bumpy called a meeting. He did not call it at Delroy's, or at the restaurant, or at any location connected to his usual operations. He sent word to Sellers through a neutral party, a retired postal worker named Gene, who was trusted by everyone precisely because he had never been involved in anything that there was a business opportunity worth discussing. Something involving the expansion of Sellers' directory into new markets. The kind of offer a man like Sellers could not refuse without explaining why he was refusing it. Sellers arrived at the meeting location, a back room above a laundromat on 136th Street at 9 o'clock on the evening of August 19th. He was humming when he came through the door. He stopped humming when he saw who was in the room. Bumpy was seated at a small table with a single lamp. 2 men stood near the far wall, not threateningly, simply present. On the table in front of Bumpy was a folded piece of paper. Sellers stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came inside, because there was nothing else to do. "Sit down, Roy," Bumpy said. Sellers sat. Bumpy unfolded the paper slowly. It was a list of business names, 14 of them, in 2 columns, written in a handwriting that Sellers recognized because it was his own. He had no idea how Bumpy had obtained it. He would not find out that evening, and the not knowing would stay with him for the rest of his life like a splinter too deep to reach. "I want to understand something," Bumpy said. His voice was completely level, not cold, not warm level, the way a carpenter's tool is level, measuring without emotion. "You've been in this neighborhood your whole life. You know what it costs these people to keep their doors open. And you sold that list to a man in a uniform for what, $40? 50? Sellers opened his mouth. Bumpy raised one hand. Not quickly, just enough. "I'm not asking you to explain it," Bumpy said. "I already understand it. I'm asking you to hear me say that I understand it so there's no confusion about what happens next." What happened next was not what Sellers expected. There was no beating. There was no threat delivered in the familiar language of Harlem violence that Sellers had been bracing for since the moment he saw who was in the room. Instead, Bumpy told him exactly what he was going to do, and exactly what Sellers' role in it would be. The lamp threw a long shadow across the wall behind Bumpy as he spoke. Sellers listened and did not interrupt and did not look away, because looking away felt more dangerous than holding eye contact with a man who was dismantling him without raising his voice. People who were alive then and willing to talk, and there weren't many, but there were some. Old men in their 80s who remembered that summer the way you remember a fever. In fragments and sensations would always pause at this part of the story. They would say that Bumpy didn't get angry that night. No shouting, no table overturned, no fist against the wall. And somehow, every single one of them said the same thing that was the most frightening part of all. Sellers left the meeting pale and silent, with instructions he would follow to the letter. The trap was set. The marked bills were prepared on the morning of August 20th. Bumpy did not handle them himself. He worked through a man named Calvin, who had spent 12 years as a bank teller before losing his position in the first wave of Depression-era layoffs, and had since applied his precise, detail-oriented mind to other arrangements. Calvin marked each bill in the stack with a sequence of small notations not obvious enough to be detected by a casual glance, but distinctive enough to be identified under examination by anyone who knew what to look for. There were 40 bills, $2,000 in total. The witness arrangement was more delicate. Bumpy needed people who would be credible, whose accounts could not be dismissed at the testimony of criminals or men with obvious reasons to lie. He spent a full day considering candidates and settled on 3. A minister from a Baptist church on 132nd Street, whose reputation was beyond question. A school teacher named Mrs. Adeline Cross, who had taught in Harlem for 22 years and was known by name to 2 different city officials. And a retired postal inspector named Harold Briggs, who had spent his career documenting exactly the kind of institutional irregularity that Pike represented. None of the 3 knew each other. None of them knew they were part of a coordinated plan. Each had been approached separately, told only that they might witness something significant on a particular evening, and asked whether they would be willing to give an honest account of what they saw. All 3 said yes. The plan was clean. The marked money would sit in Hargrove's lockbox, the same lockbox from which Pike had taken the original $3,000. When Pike arrived for his next collection, he would take the marked bills. The 3 witnesses, positioned at different vantage points, would observe the transaction. Documentation would then be delivered simultaneously to 2 places, the Internal Affairs Division of the NYPD, and a reporter at the Amsterdam News named Walter Hobbs, who had been covering police corruption in black neighborhoods for 3 years and had never yet had a case airtight enough to print. There was a reporter who worked that beat for years and later said, in print, that he had covered dozens of men in that world, but he had never once seen Bumpy Johnson walk into a situation without already knowing where the exit was. Reading that now, knowing what came next, it is hard to argue with him. Then, on the evening of August 20th, something shifted. Thomas reported it first. He had been watching Pike's afternoon rounds when he noticed a change in behavior. Pike walked his usual route, but did not collect from any of the stores. He walked past 3 doors he would normally have pushed open without slowing his pace. At the corner of 128th and Lenox, he stopped and stood for almost 4 minutes, facing the direction of Hargrove's store, before turning and walking the other way. Pike had sensed something. It was not a specific thing he had detected. No single error had been made, no conversation overheard, no face recognized that should not have been there. It was something more instinctual, the animal awareness of a man who had survived 11 years in dangerous work by learning to trust the feeling that preceded the evidence. He did not know what was wrong, but he knew something was. Bumpy received Thomas's report at 7 in the evening and sat with it for 20 minutes. The minister, the school teacher, and the postal inspector were all in position. The marked bills were in the lockbox. The reporter was waiting for a telephone call. The question was whether Pike would still come. And then a second question arrived behind the first, sharper and more urgent if Pike had sensed a trap. What would a careful man do next? A careful man would not retreat. Retreat was visible, and visible retreat was admission. A careful man would move faster than expected, harder than expected, in a direction the people waiting for him had not anticipated. Bumpy stood up from the table. "Get to Hargrove," he said. "Right now. Move him out of that store." The man he was speaking to was already at the door before the sentence finished. Hargrove was in the back room of his store when they came for him. It was 8:14 in the evening. He had been counting inventory, a task he performed every Wednesday, regardless of circumstance. A ritual of normalcy he had clung to across the past week with the particular desperation of a man who needs to believe that ordinary life is still possible. He was on the second shelf of the dry goods section, pencil behind his ear, clipboard in hand. When the back door opened and two men he recognized from the neighborhood came in without knocking. "We need you to come with us," the taller one said. "Right now. Don't bring anything." Hargrove looked at his clipboard. He set it down on the shelf carefully, spine up, the way he always did when he was in the middle of a count. "What's happening?" he said. "Someone's coming," the man said. "And it's better if you're not here when they arrive." Hargrove did not ask further questions. He had been in Harlem long enough to understand that some explanations were luxuries, and that the moment for luxury had passed some time ago. He followed them out the back door and into the alley, and then into a building 2 doors down, and then up 2 flights of stairs into an apartment where a woman he had never met handed him a cup of coffee and told him to sit away from the window. He sat. He drank the coffee. He waited. In his store. 12 minutes later, Officer Declan Pike came through the front door. He did not use the bell. He had taped it down on his way past that morning during a walkthrough that lasted 90 seconds, long enough to disable the bell, check the back room, and confirm that the lockbox was where it had always been. He had done this because Pike, whatever else he was not careless. The animal awareness that Thomas had observed on the corner of 128th and Lenox had not left him. It had simply been overridden by something stronger, the certainty that whatever was waiting for him, he could handle it faster and harder than it could handle him. He moved through the dark store with a flashlight, its beam cutting low across the floorboards, and went directly to the counter. He knew where the lockbox was. He had taken from it once already. He found it. He opened it. The bills were there. What Pike could not have known was that every bill in that lockbox had been marked by a man with 12 years of banking experience, each notation placed with the kind of precision that holds up under legal scrutiny. What he also could not have known was that Mrs. Adeline Cross was seated in the window of the apartment building, directly across the street with a clear sightline to the store interior. Committing every detail of his movement to memory with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent 22 years teaching children to observe and record, he took the money, all of it, $2,000 in marked bills, folded and placed inside his jacket in the same practiced motion Hargrove had watched 8 days earlier. He was turning to leave when he heard something. It came from behind the counter, a small sound. The involuntary exhale of someone who has been holding their breath too long and cannot hold it anymore. Pike's flashlight swung toward it instantly, behind the counter, crouched against the lower shelves with his knees pulled to his chest, was a boy. He was perhaps 14 years old, small for his age, with large eyes that caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and failing completely. His name was Eddie. He ran messages for half a dozen people in the neighborhood, knew every back alley between 125th and 140th, and had been placed in the store as a last-minute observer, meant only to watch and slip out before Pike arrived. He had not slipped out in time. Pike looked at the boy for a long moment. The store smelled of canned goods and floor wax and something stale underneath both. The accumulated breath of a business that had been running scared for 2 weeks. Then Pike reached down and grabbed Eddie by the collar and pulled him upright in one motion. The way a man picks up something he intends to use. "Who sent you?" Pike said. Eddie said nothing. His mouth was working, but no sound came out. The smell of Pike's cologne, something cheap and chemical, like cleaning fluid mixed with flowers, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat, filled the small space behind the counter completely. Eddie would carry that smell in his memory for the rest of his life, the way the mind preserves the details of moments when it understood, for the first time, what real danger felt like. Pike's grip tightened on the collar. The fabric pulled across Eddie's throat. "I asked you a question," Pike said, quieter now, which was worse than loud. Across the street, Mrs. Cross noted the time, 8:51 p.m., and added to her account the detail of the boy, The grip, the angle of the flashlight, the precise sequence of everything she could see from her window. Her handwriting was small and even, and she did not pause between observations. She did not move from the window. 3 blocks away, in a telephone booth on the corner of 7th Avenue, a man was already dialing the number for Walter Hobbs at the Amsterdam News. The trap had not gone cleanly. Eddie was in Pike's hands, and that was not how it was supposed to go. But the money was marked. The witnesses were in position. The reporter was on the line. Bumpy had said once, quietly, to no one in particular, that a plan was not a prediction, it was a preparation. The difference mattered most when something went wrong. Something had gone wrong. The next move was already waiting. Eddie was still behind the counter when it happened. Pike had not released him. He had pulled the boy to the front of the store and positioned him against the wall beside the door, one hand gripping his collar, the other resting on his belt in a way that was meant to communicate something specific about the options available. Eddie stood very still. His eyes were fixed on the floor. His breathing was shallow and fast, the way a small animal breathes when it understands that movement will make things worse. Pike was thinking. That was the dangerous part, not the anger, not the greed, but the thinking. Pike was a man who had survived 11 years of this work because he could calculate in real time, could read a situation and adjust before the situation adjusted him. He knew something was wrong. He had known it for 2 days. What he did not know was the shape of it, how far it extended, how many people were involved, whether the boy against the wall was the edge of it or the center. He looked at Eddie for a long moment. "Last time," Pike said. "Who sent you?" Eddie raised his eyes from the floor. He was 14 years old and he was terrified. But there was something else in his face now. A thin, hard line of resolve that had not been there a moment ago. The expression of someone who has decided that there is one thing they will not do regardless of what it costs them. "Nobody sent me," Eddie said. "I came in to get out of the rain." It was not a convincing lie. Pike knew it was not a convincing lie. But in the moment that followed, something else happened. Something that Pike did not anticipate and could not have planned for. The front window of the store lit up, not dramatically, not all at once. A single beam of light, moving slowly across the glass from outside. The kind of light that comes from a flashlight carried at waist height by someone walking with purpose on the sidewalk. Then a second beam. Then the sound of footsteps, more than one set, unhurried, deliberate on the pavement directly outside the door. Pike released Eddie's collar. He stepped back from the door, deeper into the shadow of the store interior, and his right hand moved to the side of his jacket. He stood completely still and listened. The footsteps stopped outside the door, then a voice calm, official, belonging to someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say came through the glass. "Officer Pike, this is Sergeant Donahue, Internal Affairs. We have a warrant. Please step outside with your hands visible." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Eddie would tell this story many times, in many different rooms, across many decades, and he always said the same thing about those 4 seconds. The sound Pike made was not anger and not fear. It was the sound of a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to, hoping somehow that the numbers would come out different this time. They did not come out different. Pike stepped out of the store with his hands at his sides, not raised, a small act of defiance that cost him nothing and meant everything to him. Sergeant Donahue was standing on the sidewalk with 2 other officers and a man in a civilian coat whom Pike did not recognize. The man in the civilian coat was holding a manila envelope. The envelope contained everything. The marked bill descriptions, cross-referenced with serial numbers Calvin had recorded before the money entered the lockbox. The written accounts of 3 witnesses, the minister, the school teacher, the postal inspector, each signed and dated, each describing the same sequence of events from 3 different positions. And a fourth document, a full record of Pike's collection activity across 11 transactions, 7 businesses, documented with the kind of granular detail that comes from days of patient watching. Donahue opened the envelope. He read the first page. He read the second. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, the particular shift that occurs when a man realizes the decision in front of him has already been made for him by the weight of what he is holding. He looked at Pike. "Your badge," he said. Bumpy had understood this from the beginning, that the precinct would not protect Pike out of loyalty. They would only protect him if protection was cheaper than exposure. Every piece of paper in that envelope was Bumpy's answer to that calculation. He had not beaten the system. He had used it against itself, the way you use a man's own weight to put him on the ground. Pike reached up and unpinned the badge from his chest. He held it for a moment, not long, just long enough for everyone present to understand that the pause was deliberate. Then he placed it in Donahue's open palm with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, as though completing a transaction he had always known was coming and had simply been postponing. Across the street, in the window of the apartment building, Mrs. Adeline Cross closed her notebook. She had written 11 pages. The arrest was processed quietly. That was the first thing Harlem noticed, not the arrest itself, but the silence around it. No announcement. No precinct statement. No name in the morning papers. Pike was removed from the neighborhood the way a splinter is removed quickly, with the minimum of ceremony, in a way designed to leave as small a mark as possible. By the morning of August 22nd, he was gone. His patrol car was reassigned. His locker was cleaned out. The desk sergeant at the 123rd Street precinct, when asked by a reporter whether an Officer Declan Pike was currently on active duty, consulted his roster with an expression of careful neutrality and said he was not able to comment on personnel matters. Walter Hobbs published the story 2 days later. It ran on page 3 of the Amsterdam News, not the front page, which surprised some people. But Hobbs had made a deliberate calculation. Front page meant immediate denial, immediate pressure, the full machinery of institutional self-protection grinding into motion before the ink was dry. Page 3 meant the story entered the bloodstream of the neighborhood slowly, reaching every part before anyone in power understood what was happening. The headline was precise and unembellished. Harlem officer removed following extortion investigation. Beneath it, 11 paragraphs. He named Pike. He named 7 businesses. He cited the marked bills, the witness accounts, the internal affairs warrant. Hobbs had covered this neighborhood for a long time, and he knew that the most durable stories were the ones built entirely from things that could be verified, no speculation, no color, just the documented sequence of what happened and in what order. He did not name Bumpy Johnson anywhere in the text. He did not need to. Harlem understood. The second thing that happened, in the 48 hours following Pike's removal, was the exposure of Roy Sellers. This was not done through newspapers or official channels. It was done the way Harlem had always handled certain kinds of accounting, through the same informal network that had carried Hargrove's message 11 days earlier. Within 2 days, every significant business owner along the extortion corridor knew that Sellers had sold the list. They knew the amount he had been paid. They knew about the debt with Hargrove. They knew everything. Sellers closed his shoe repair shop on the morning of August 23rd. He moved to a rooming house in the Bronx before the end of the month and did not return to Harlem for 11 years. When he finally came back, as an old man with a bad knee and a habit of looking over his shoulder, the neighborhood had no memory of his shop and no interest in his name, which was perhaps the most complete form of erasure available in a place that forgot nothing. Pike was processed through an internal disciplinary hearing, not a criminal court. The distinction mattered enormously to the precinct. A criminal court would have been public, on the record. open to any journalist who showed up with a press badge. An internal hearing was a closed room and a conclusion reached by men whose primary interest was containing damage before it spread further than it already had. Pike was stripped of his badge and pension. He was given a formal reprimand. He was escorted out of the building. He was not charged. He was not imprisoned. He left Harlem in the back of an unmarked car on the morning of August 22nd, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a single bag. 2 officers from Internal Affairs sat in the front. Nobody spoke. At a red light on the approach to the bridge, Pike turned and looked out the rear window. Everyone who told this part of the story, and several people told it, from different vantage points, with details that varied in the retelling the way all true stories vary, agreed on one thing. The look on his face was not defeat. It was not remorse. It was the flat, patient expression of a man cataloging something for future reference. The way a man looks at a door he intends to come back to. Then the light changed. The car moved forward. Harlem fell away behind the glass, block by block, until there was nothing left of it but the gray line of the bridge and the water beneath it and the sky above, indifferent to all of it. The neighborhood would say afterward that they had never seen a man in a uniform disappear so fast one day, pressing his weight against every counter on the corridor. The next day gone as completely as if the street itself had swallowed him. It was the speed of it that unsettled people most, not the removal, the speed, as though he had never been as permanent as he seemed, as though the whole thing, from the very beginning, had always been a question of who was willing to make the decision first. 3 days after Pike disappeared, Bumpy Johnson called a meeting. It was not a large meeting. 8 people, seated in the back room of a restaurant closed for the evening, the front windows dark, the kitchen cold, no food on the table, no drinks. 8 people and a single overhead light that threw everything below it into sharp relief and left the edges of the room in deep shadow. The 8 people represented, between them, most of the significant commercial and social infrastructure of a 12-block radius. A numbers operator, 2 bar owners, a man who managed 3 rooming houses, a woman who ran a catering operation out of a church kitchen, the minister from 132nd Street, who had come not as a witness this time but as himself, Thomas, the newspaper vendor, and Grace, the seamstress, who sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on Bumpy throughout. Bumpy stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. "Pike is gone," he said. "I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly. Pike being gone is not the end of the problem. Pike was one man. The problem is the system that made Pike possible, the understanding, on both sides of that precinct desk, that what he was doing would be tolerated. That understanding still exists. It will produce another Pike, possibly 2, possibly someone smarter." He let that settle for a moment. "What changed this week is not the system," he continued. "What changed is what happens to the next man who tries it, and that change has to be visible. It has to travel the way everything travels in this neighborhood, faster than any newspaper, further than any official announcement." The minister said, "What are you asking us to do?" Bumpy looked at him. "I'm asking you to remember what you saw. Not the legal version, not the version that ends up in a courtroom. What you actually saw: a man walk into a grocery store and take everything a family had saved across 14 months, and walk out in a uniform, and come back for more the next morning. I'm asking you to make sure that memory stays alive here. Because the only thing that changes what a man like Pike calculates is the certainty that next time, the story will not stay quiet." Silence in the room. Then the woman who ran the catering operation said, "And Sellers?" Bumpy's expression did not change. "Sellers is gone. What Sellers did selling his neighbors to a man with a badge over a debt that was never worth what it cost, That is a lesson this neighborhood needed to learn. I would rather it had been learned another way, but it wasn't. So now everyone knows what that choice looks like, and what it costs the man who makes it. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice dropped slightly, not softer, but slower, each word set down with care. I want to be clear about something. What happened this week was not a war. It was not revenge. It was a correction. This neighborhood does not need a war. It needs a line. A line that everyone on both sides of a badge understands will not be crossed without consequences they cannot contain. Grace, who had not spoken since she arrived, looked up from her folded hands. "And if they cross it anyway," she said. Bumpy looked at her for a moment. "Then we do it again," he said. "Exactly the same way. Patient. Clean. No bodies. No fire. Just evidence, witnesses, and the right person reading the right document at the right moment." He paused. "That is the only version of this that doesn't cost the neighborhood more than it gains." There were people who spent years afterward trying to piece together exactly what was said in that room: journalists, investigators, neighbors who heard versions of it secondhand and tried to reconstruct the original from the fragments. The full account was never recovered. It never could be. Because the people in that room understood, without being told, that some conversations were not meant to survive the evening in which they happened. What was reconstructed came from partial recollections, told carefully, years later, by people who chose their words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the 8 people left through different exits, at different times, in different directions, the kind of operational discipline that had kept things intact in a neighborhood where the walls had always been potentially thin. Bumpy left last. He went through the back door, into the alley behind the building, and turned toward 134th Street. The alley smelled of rain and garbage and something faintly chemical from a building further down the block. A cat on a fire escape 2 floors up watched him pass without moving. He walked without hurrying. There was no reason to hurry. Everything that needed to be done had been done, and the things that remained would happen on their own schedule now, carried forward by the neighborhood itself the way a current carries whatever you place in it. 3 blocks away, Samuel Hargrove was in his store. The bell above the door was fixed. The shelves were stocked. The lockbox beneath the counter held what it held, and no one was coming for it tonight, and no one would be coming for it tomorrow. The light above the door was on the small, warm, unremarkable light of a business that was open and intended to stay that way. Bumpy turned at the end of the alley and stepped into the street. He did not look back. In 11 years of working these blocks, he had made it a rule never to look back at a thing once it was finished, not out of indifference and not out of pride, because looking back was how you confused what was done with what still remained to be done. And in Harlem in 1936 there was always something that still remained. He walked 2 blocks north, turned west, and disappeared into the ordinary dark of an August night. Behind him, the neighborhood breathed. The store was open. The light was on. That was enough. 2 days later, Harlem looked exactly the same. Same streets, same heat, same faces, but something had shifted quietly, permanently, the way the ground shifts before anyone feels it. A crooked cop was gone. A small store was still open, and Bumpy Johnson had not fired a single shot to make either of those things true. That is the kind of power most people never see coming, because it doesn't arrive loud. It arrives patient, precise, inevitable. Stories like this one survived because ordinary people chose to remember them. Corner to corner, generation to generation. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more waiting. And tell us below, was Bumpy Johnson protecting Harlem or just replacing one power with another? Some questions don't have easy answers. That's exactly why they're worth asking.